Hey everybody, thanks for joining and thanks for watching this. Many of you end up watching it after it goes live, so that's good. But I want to get started tonight. And the purpose of this presentation is we're hearing a lot about inflation. And we hear percentages and numbers and statements. And I thought it would be a good idea to do a Facebook Live where I just make it as educational as possible about the numbers you're hearing and the percentages you're hearing and what the politicians are saying. And hopefully help everybody understand how awful inflation is and why it's so important that we get it under control. So let me start by saying inflation is measured based on the changes in the consumer price index. All right, the changes in the consumer price index. Now, there's various different kinds of consumer price indexes, but the one that's used generally is All Urban Consumer Price Index, so CPI. So for example, in August, the Consumer Price Index was 296.171. So they measure that against the Consumer Price Index for the August before in 2021, and that's where when you hear the percentage of 8.3%. That's what they're talking about. The Consumer Price Index for August 2022 as compared to the Consumer Price Index CPI for the August before. So that's just, I want to establish that foundation as I throw around these numbers. So let's go back and talk about past inflation. And on my other computer here, I have some charts up. I probably ought to learn how to get these on this screen. But you have heard that these latest inflation rates are the greatest that they've been in 40 years. So let's go back. Let's go back to the late 70s and early 80s. And I'll give you percentages of the CPIs back then. So, in 1979, for example, the Consumer Price Index for the year, the average for the year, the increases from the year before was 11.3%. And the high for 1979 was 13.3% in December of that year, and the low was 9.3% in January of that year. So the average for 1979 was 11.3%. So when everyone says, oh my gosh, we're seeing inflation as high as it's been in 40 years, this is what they're talking about. And then in 1980, the Consumer Price Index was 13.5% increase for the year from the year before. So, and just a little history lesson here. What happened in 1980? President Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter, and this is part of the reason. Inflation was roaring, interest rates were high, and then in 1981, Consumer Price Index increases for the year was 10.3% less. And then after that, it started coming down, 6.2%. So Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Fed, and Reagan, they were getting inflation under control. Now, here's something. Remember, I said this is 1 year compared to the previous year. So if you go and look at what the CPI was for those years, and this is something that I think you really need to pay attention to. this is compounding. So if you have 1 year it goes up 10% and the next year it goes up 10%, it's compounding. Now we know when we invest money, compounding is a good thing. When inflation's compounding, it's a really bad thing. So if you go and look at, let me find it here. Yeah, here's the CPI data. So if you go and you look at, for example, the CPI for August 1977, it was 61, all right? And then if you go to August 1981, so 4 years, the CPI was 91.6. What that means is essentially prices from 1977 to 1981, increased by a total of 50%. So that's the danger of inflation. So in 4 years, prices increased by 50%. And that's why we got to get inflation under control, because it is devastating to what people are making. And keep in mind, while wages are going up, they're only going up 4% or so. So the cost of goods is much greater. The increase is much greater than the increases in what people are making. So now here's the other thing historically about inflation that I think it's important everybody understand. And I'm looking at a chart here that goes the whole way back for many years, and I got to get my glasses on to see this. But very rarely, very, very rarely is inflation negative or deflation. So historically, just looking at this, there was deflation by 0.4%, so very little, in 2009. Well, what was that? That was the Great Recession. And that's why we had deflationary pressures. And deflation's a bad thing, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then if you go back historically, I'm just looking back and finding what years it was negative. 1955, it was negative 0.4%. 1949, negative 1.2%. And then you get the whole way back into the Great Depression, where the deflation was severe. Minus 9%, minus 9.9% in 1931-32. Deflation's bad, because that means the economy is collapsing. So the point of that is this inflation that we're seeing, these prices are not likely to come down, and they'll only come down if we have a severe economic crisis, a Great Recession or depression. We don't want that. These prices are likely going to stay where they are. Now, the challenge is we want to stop the severe increase in prices, the 8.3%, the 8%, the 9%. That's the challenge. So inflation present. Let's talk a little bit about that. So you get some historic perspective on inflation and why it's so bad. So the challenge becomes is we want to slow down the increases in inflation. Now, the Federal Reserve's target is to have inflation at 2%, and a little bit of inflation is good because it indicates a growing economy. Like I said, we don't want deflation. So today, as I mentioned, the CPI is at 296 in August. And in August 2021, it was 273. That increase is about 8.3%. And if you go back 2 years to 2020, the CPI was 259.9 versus 296.1. So you see the increase in 2 years. That's the compounding effect. So the idea here is reduce the increase in the CPI. And now you've probably heard President Biden say, "Gee, it's not going up," and we all say, "Well, what's he talking about?" Well, this is what he's talking about, just so you know. As compared to July and June of this year, the CPI has been flat. So in August, it was 296.171. And that was August. In July, it was 296.276. And in June, it was 296.311. So June, July, August, it was, the CPI was relatively the same, even though as compared to those months from the previous year, the increase was 8.3, and I'll go to that chart in a minute. And then in May, the CPI was 292. So it was going up on a month-to-month basis. So that's why Biden is saying that. It doesn't mean that, there is some leveling out, and hopefully the prices will be stable. Now, the other thing you should be aware of when we talk about present inflation is, remember what I said, that these are percentages compared to the year before. So we are going to start seeing the comparables up against bigger numbers from the year before. So what do I mean by that? If you take December, for example, of 2021, inflation was 7%. So that CPI number was higher. And so the comparable for December this year is going to be up against a higher number. So you're likely going to hear, as we get into the end of the year, that the percentage increase in the CPI is going down. But don't be fooled by that. Hopefully it will go down, because that means the increases aren't as great, but they're still high. The CPI, if it stays at 296, prices will stay the same, but the percentage you're going to hear is going to be much lower, because we're comparing it to a bigger number. Does that make sense? And just to flush that example out a little more, if you look at December 2021, the increase was 7%. And if you look at December 2020, the increase was 1.4%. So that indicates a pretty severe increase year to year, obviously. But we should see that number coming down, but not because prices are coming down, but because the comparables, they're comparing to a higher CPI number. So now if you go, and this is, excuse me, let me get some coffee here. If you go and you look at the individual items, we know that the price of gasoline's been coming down, and in the last few months, and so that actually acts to reduce the inflation, but the inflation's still high, and this is why. Let me explain to you why. Because when you look at food inflation, food inflation has been going really high. So when we go to the grocery store, in August, food inflation was 11.4% compared to the previous year. And we're seeing that in the grocery stores, right? So that was higher than the overall number of 8.3%. That was higher, but gasoline was lower, and therefore you come in at 8.3%. So we are seeing these high food prices, and it's been going up. So the beginning of the year, food inflation in January was 7%. In August, it was 11.4%, and that was offset by a reduction in the price of gasoline. So then ask yourself, well, why is the price of gasoline going down? What's going on with that? Well, I'll give you my theory on why it's going down. It went down, oh my gosh, a lot this year. And here's why, I think. If you look at the domestic oil production in this country, we know that a couple things happened. We know that that big oil got hammered in the pandemic. And that's why when you hear the politicians, the Democrats say, big oil made $70 billion, the five big oil companies made $70 billion in 2021. Well, they lost about $70 billion in 2020. So production, the peak production was really December 2019, and that was 13 million gallons a day. And then it dropped off. It dropped off to a low of 9.9 million gallons a day, not gallons, barrels, a day. And that was because of the pandemic. Demand went in the tank. So as we came out of the pandemic, demand increased, and today the daily barrels is 11.8 million of domestic production, which is about a million, a little more than a million less than what our peak production was. So when you hear Biden saying he's releasing 1 million barrels of oil a month from the strategic oil reserve, all right, guess what? Added to that 11.8 million barrels a day plus a million, you get the domestic oil supply about where it was at its peak. And that's why the prices of gas have been coming down. And I think in addition is demand has been down because, everything's so expensive that, demand is going down. And keep in mind, I know that the talking heads on TV say that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And what it happens when supply and demand is out of whack. All right. When demand is greater than supply, prices go up. So demand and supply is out of whack. That causes inflation. Yes, there's demand because there's a lot of money out there from COVID, and supply's down because we have these supply chain issues, and businesses slowed down because of COVID, and it's out of whack. So that's what's causing this. Now, so what does the future? And by the way, if anyone has any questions, type them in here. What do we expect in the future? If we go back historically, and I was talking at the beginning about inflation in the late 70s and early 80s, and then Reagan gets elected, and Paul Volcker comes in to run he's chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he just cranked up interest rates to reduce the supply of money, which then reduces demand. So it brings demand down. Less demand results in less inflation. The other thing that happened is Reagan then passed the Tax Reduction Act. And what did that do? All right. That put more money, all right, because businesses were paying less taxes, so they were investing that money in their businesses and increasing supply. So supply was going up, demand was coming down, got in balance, and in a couple years, inflation was dropping off in 2 or 3 years to a very manageable 3-4%. And that really has sustained until this last year. And listen, it was a combination of monetary policy, what the Federal Reserve was doing, and increasing interest rates, and fiscal policy. What Reagan was doing is reducing tax rates, reducing government regulation, making it more beneficial for businesses to create more supply. So that's how it was under control then. What's the future look like? I think, the Fed is raising interest rates. They're going to probably raise them again this week by 75 basis points, and maybe even one percentage point. And again, to decrease demand, slow down the economy. The problem is, the federal government spending, the fiscal policy, is still pushing all this money into the economy, and that creates demand. So you got one force, the monetary policy, trying to push demand down, and then you got government spending pushing demand up. So it's not a great formula, in my opinion, to get this inflation under control. The other part of this that I find a little bit interesting is our national debt. I mean, we're at $30 trillion and going higher. And I remember 2 years ago when I was campaigning for the U.S. Senate here in New Hampshire, I was talking about the national debt being at 21 trillion, 22 trillion. The debt, the interest, with interest rates going up on that debt, can become very devastating to our budget. It soon may be, interest on our debt soon may be the largest part of the federal government's budget. I think, they really don't pass a budget anymore, and then with all these special bills, but I think you're going to be looking at a $5 trillion budget if you scrape out all this one-time spending with infrastructure and student loan forgiveness. $5 trillion budget. The biggest component of that historically has been defense spending, $750 billion, $800 billion for defense of a $5 trillion budget. Well, if you think about interest on $30 trillion, at 4 or 5% or 3%, just to keep the math easy, on if it's 5% on 30 trillion, then 5% of 30 trillion is $1.5 trillion. Cut that in half. Let's say interest rates 2.5%. That's $750 billion in interest. And that's a huge problem for our country. Huge problem for our country. So, it will be interesting to see how this inflation plays out. I think unless we get fiscal spending under control, it's going to be hard to bring that inflation down to the 2% target that the Fed wants. And I'll remind you what I said earlier, that rate will come down as a natural consequence of the comparables to the previous year CPI. We're going to start comparing to a higher CPI from the previous year. So I don't, I'm not optimistic. I hope I'm wrong. I hope inflation comes down. I think the other part of this that, I was mentioning that I mentioned the national debt of 30 trillion. Well, when you got this kind of inflation, that debt is worth a lot less. So if we have 10% inflation, 30 trillion in debt is really 27 trillion in debt. So it becomes a way to reduce the national debt. At any rate, so I hope you've found this helpful. And that, so when you hear these numbers, the inflation rate, it's comparing CPI to the CPI from a year earlier, and it's the increase in the year, in that year, and right now the CPI is around 296, just a little over it. Those comparables, and I ran into this in the restaurant industry. You're always talking about comp sales the year before. The comparables will, in this case, in inflation, will get easier because you're comparing to a higher CPI number from the year before. But it'll stay high. The other thing is, these prices will not go down. Historically, we've only had deflation in very severe economic circumstances, the Great Recession, the Depression. We don't want that. So these prices are going to likely stay where they are, and the hope is you get inflation under control at 2%, wages start growing at 4 or 5%, and then it's just a matter of time to where the average American's buying power is back to where it was before this inflation hit. But in the meantime, this is painful. This is really, really painful. I mean, I know when I go to the grocery store, I am surprised at how much food costs. And as I mentioned, the CPI for food in August was 11.4%. So at any rate, I'm rambling. I don't see any questions, so that's great. I hope you found this helpful. Tom Spelzy is watching. How you doing, Tom? Tom is a classmate of mine from West Point. And so I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, send me an email at corkymessner@gmail.com. My phone number's on my Facebook page. Call me. And if you have any suggestions on what you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. And I hope this was educational for you. Not political. It was more educational. Thank you, and have a great evening and beautiful day here in New Hampshire. We'll see you.